Good afternoon, and welcome to the Washington Institute. It is appropriate, and I think the gods are smiling, that we have a British-style rainy day for us to convene today's event to discuss Bernard Lewis. Today is not a memorial event. I have not asked our panelists to offer eulogies of Bernard. Rather, today is a moment to step back and offer an assessment of what we have called a scholar of consequence, a scholar who has had such an impact in such a broad array of fields. At a moment when public intellectuals seem to be a rare breed, and especially public intellectuals that have such a constructive impact on the way we think of the world around us and the way we organize ourselves to address problems in the world around us, the way we think about our past and our relationship with other cultures and civilizations, and how thinking about that past helps train our mind to think about the world ahead. I think we owe it to ourselves to take this moment to step back and to consider the accomplishments of Professor Bernard Lewis and the life of consequence in which he led. Let me take this moment before we proceed to just welcome a couple of very special guests. First, I'm really delighted that Michael and Jessica are here. Michael Lewis and Jessica Lewis. In addition to being, of course, Bernard's son, Michael and I go back 33 years to share an office here at the Washington Institute when the entire Washington Institute could fit inside of a closet. And so I'm really delighted that you're here, that both of you are here today. I'm especially delighted that Bunsey Churchill is here today, Bernard's companion of so many years and partner in so much of that he has done in recent years. Welcome. Thank you for being with us. I'm delighted that there are so many people here today that have been connected to Bernard in many ways. Harold Rode, very special connection to Bernard. Former students of Bernard, like Alan Makovsky, who first engineered the original Turgot Ozal Memorial Lecture here at the Washington Institute many years ago when Bernard was our inaugural lecturer. Can I just ask, are there other students of Bernard that are here today? Because I didn't want to leave any particular students out. Okay, very good. Did I miss someone? Great. 10 years ago, the Washington Institute established a very special award, our Scholar-Statesman Award, an award that was meant to recognize what we decided were the two most important foundational principles of what we do and who we are, namely the intersection of scholarship and statesmanship. And we wanted to have an award that would reflect those ideals. And so for our very first honorees, we had to hit a home run. We had to hit honorees that would, without a doubt, make a statement that reflected the depth and the honor that would go with this award. And so, to represent statesmanship, we had George Shultz. We hit a grand slam. And to represent scholarship, Bernard was kind enough to agree to accept the award, a double grand slam. And so, to begin today's event, of all the hours of all sorts of televised interviews that we could show, I thought it would be appropriate to show at least a brief snippet from the award ceremony of the first Washington Institute Scholar-Statesman Award 10 years ago with George Shultz and Bernard. And it begins with a cameo by Itamar Rabinovich, who introduced Bernard at this event. So why don't we just go straight to the tape, as the saying goes.
Another typical Bernard Lewis story from the lore. He was once speaking at an American university about Islam, and an angry student from the Middle East stood up at the end of the lecture and said, "Professor Lewis, how can you speak about Islam? You're not a Muslim. You have not lived the Islamic experience from within." And Professor Lewis smiled wryly and said, "By extension of your logic, sir, only fish could teach marine biology in this university."
I might say that when you asked me to come here and have a conversation with Bernard Lewis, I think I said to you, I would be glad to come, but I would rather listen to Bernard Lewis than have a conversation with him. Because he is such, he wrote a book not too long ago called What Went Wrong. It's a fantastic book. And you read the things that he writes, and if you're halfway alert from page to page, you're just bound to learn a lot. So it's a great privilege, Bernard, to be here with you. And as a graduate of Princeton, I'm very proud of the fact that you are a professor at Princeton.
In considering the lessons of history, it is useful, and I realize that this is an unpopular minority view, it is useful to look at what actually happened. What we are confronting at the present time is a third deformation, this time of a religion, of Islam. Now, in saying that, I don't mean to go all the way with some people who tell us that Islam is a religion of peace, rather like the Quakers, but without their aggressiveness. No, I'm not going that far. But Islam, as we confront it now in these extremist movements, that is a deformation of Islam, no less than Nazism and Bolshevism were deformations of movements in themselves not unworthy. And I think it's very important for us to understand that at the present time and to define our policies accordingly. My optimism, such as it is, derives principally from the expectation of foolishness and error on the part of our adversaries. This has usually been our best hope in the past. And one can see already that our adversaries in the present struggle are gearing up for similar mistakes and have made quite a few in the past. If you look at the writings and other pronouncements of Osama bin Laden, a man of extraordinary eloquence and frankness, you can get a fairly good idea of what their thinking is. Right through the 90s, he said, it became increasingly clear that the Americans have become pampered and effeminate and incompetent. The refrain was, hit them and they'll run. And everything seemed to confirm it. One attack after another on American bases, warships, troops, embassies, you name it, with absolutely no response, except for angry words and expensive missiles dispatched to remote and uninhabited places. What happened on 9/11 was the culmination of Series 1 and intended to be the opening of Series 2. That is to say, Series 1 to drive the infidels from the lands of Islam, Series 2 to bring the true faith to the lands of the infidels. 9/11 was intended to be the opening blast of that new phase. What followed that came as a complete surprise and obviously threw them into complete disarray. Since then, they've been discussing it further, and they have watched the debate, the discussion here since then. What we see is the free debate of an open democratic society. What they see is weakness and fear and indecision. That's how it looks to them. And they are drawing the corresponding conclusions. And I have no doubt that this will lead them in due course to make further mistakes of the kind that the late Mahatma Gandhi used to describe as Himalayan blunders.
I can only say how much I miss such clarity of thinking and such acuity in our public discourse today. So I have asked three different former students of Bernard, three accomplished people in different walks of professional life, to look at the question of Bernard's impact in different arenas, in the world of scholarship, in the world of public policy, in the world of even literary achievement. They each have different stories, different backgrounds, different ways to appreciate Bernard's contribution as a scholar of consequence to our understanding of the world of Islam and of America and the West's relationship to Islam. And I'm really delighted that we can have this panel presentation today. So let me introduce our panelists and ask them to come up and make some remarks, and then we'll have an opportunity to have our own free and open democratic discussion with them and with you when they're concluded. First, I'd like to turn to the Washington Institute's own Martin Kramer. Martin is the Institute's Koret Visiting Fellow. He is the founding president of Shalem College in Jerusalem. He is a scholar, of course, of modern Middle East history and politics. His most recent book is titled The War on Error, which is a pungent and prescient critique of how we misread, we, the collective we, obviously nobody in this room, but how we misread history and politics in the Middle East. And I'm really delighted that Martin, a former student of Bernard's, is here to offer his remarks. Speaking after Martin will be Katherine Nouri Hughes. Katherine brings a very different life background and perspective to this discussion. She is the author of the highly acclaimed historical novel, The Mapmaker's Daughter. Here it is, which exists because of Bernard's suggestion, advice, and inspiration. This tells the story of the most powerful woman in the Ottoman Empire under Suleiman the Magnificent. Katherine is on the Board of Trustees of the American University of Cairo. She's on the Board of Advisors of the Princeton Middle East Program. And I was very happy that Katherine accepted my invitation to speak today because having an impact even so far as the world of fiction and literature underscores the extent of Bernard's consequence and impact in the world around us. So I'm delighted Katherine is here. Speaking third is Michael Doran. Mike is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, former senior director of the National Security Council in the Bush administration, the second Bush administration, or the administration of the second President Bush. Mike is an historian with an excellent book on Eisenhower policy in the Middle East, and lives at the intersection of history and policy. And so I'm delighted that you're here to offer that perspective on Bernard's consequential impact on our public discourse. So with no further ado, I'll turn the floor over to Martin. And as Martin comes here, I was remiss in not also acknowledging the presence of the ambassador of Iraq, His Excellency Fareed Yassin. I'm delighted that you're here with us as well. Martin.
Thank you, Rob. Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here, privileged to be here. And I want to say a word also of thanks to Rob Satloff. Rob was not a student of Bernard's, but he was a disciple of Bernard's. And I think the Washington Institute distinguished itself over the years by honoring Bernard, giving him a platform in the city. And that I attribute first and foremost to you. So thank you very much. I do not come to the subject of Bernard Lewis as a disinterested observer. I first met him in 1976 when I was a graduate student at Princeton, and he was a recently arrived transplant from London. By progression, he became my teacher, my PhD advisor, professional mentor, and then a personal friend. There were 38 years between us, but the age difference never seemed to matter much. Instead, he seemed to defy aging. This he attributed to good genes, a daily walk, and a scotch each evening before dinner. In 1996, I organized a conference in Israel in honor of his 80th birthday, thinking it would pretty much cap the final act of his career. Who would have imagined that 5 years later that he'd have 2 New York Times bestsellers and have become a true celebrity. But he didn't continue to speak and write simply because he could. True, no one had his combination of profound knowledge and clear exposition. But that's not why he refused to surrender to old age. He came up for another round and then another because a fire burned within him. That fire never burned more intensely than at times of war, in particular when freedom and democracy came under attack. I'd like to devote the few minutes I have to Lewis in World War II, the Cold War, and what I'll call, after one of his book titles, the crisis of Islam. 3 wars that constituted for him a continuum. In 2006, Lewis, who was then 90, told an interviewer this: "The most vividly remembered year of my life was the year 1940. I submit that 1940 is essential to understanding what drove Bernard Lewis. The year of Dunkirk and the fall of France, the Battle of Britain and the Blitz. The year of blood, toil, tears, and sweat, their finest hour." Lewis was 23 years old, already regarded as a prodigy, indeed a genius. One of the last things he did before his mobilization was to rush his doctoral dissertation into print. It was published in London in 1940. Lewis didn't regard it as a finished product, but he published it anyway because he wasn't sure what fate the war held in store for him. Lewis was always reticent when it came to the details of his 5 years of service. He spent some time at Bletchley Park helping to break codes. In 1941, he moved over to MI6. He described his task there as translating texts mostly from Arabic. For much of the time, it was just a desk job. Later, some admirers and also detractors fancifully cast him as Lewis of Arabia. Far from it. Only in the summer of 1945, when the war was almost over, did his duties take him to the Middle East. Otherwise, he said, "I spent the greater part of the Blitz years living, working, and more remarkably, sleeping in London." Now, as it happened, this was a far more dangerous place than anywhere in the Middle East. 43,000 civilians perished in the Blitz. In terms of deaths, that comes to almost 2 9/11s a month for 8 months of almost ceaseless bombing. And yet, civilian morale held, and Lewis was a case in point. In his memoirs, he recalled that at first he took shelter in tube stations. "But I soon got tired of this," he wrote, "and decided to stay in my bed and take my chances. One can get used to anything." Many years later, in 1991, he found himself in Tel Aviv when some Iraqi Scuds fell on the city. The Israelis, some of whom were seized by panic, disappointed him. A few dozen raining Scuds, he said, were like a quiet night in London, 1940. In 1940, Lewis later said, "We knew who we were, we knew who the enemy was, we knew the dangers and the issues. In our island, we knew we would prevail, that the Americans would be drawn into the fight," end of quote. But the war shattered the complacency of a generation. Freedom and democracy were fragile constructs. They had determined enemies, and in a moment's hesitation, they might be extinguished. In September 1945, at war's end, Lewis wrote a poem entitled The Dirge. It dwells not on victory, but on its terrible cost. I quote from the opening. In the bleakness of German plains, in the stillness of English woods, in the squalor of Polish towns, in the clamor of London streets, I see them die. I don't think Lewis often shared his emotions about these years, but make no mistake, the war that reduced much of civilized Europe to ruins, that left Britain shabby and impoverished, and exterminated Europe's Jews, became Lewis's prism on the world. He later called the war the seminal experience of my life. Of his own generation, he wrote that, and I quote him, their every thought, their whole lives were dominated and indeed shaped by the titanic struggles in which they had participated or witnessed. And that was Lewis too. He would be ever vigilant in the defense of liberal democracy, lest it ever be threatened with extinction again. Nor could he forget that in freedom's most imperiled and finest hour, many Arabs had sided with the enemy. After all, he'd spent the war translating evidence of their collaboration. The World War was followed by the Cold War. For Lewis's generation, this gave rise to some ambivalence. He once described his own early approach to history as quasi-Marxist. In 1953, he said this, and I quote him, I grew up in a generation which was deeply affected by what was happening in Russia, and which felt, generally speaking, that with all the brutalities and crimes of the Russian Revolution, it nevertheless represented something valuable and significant for humanity. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive. And I am therefore perhaps able to understand something of the attraction as well as of the repulsion of the communist creed. The attraction, he added, was that it had perverted to its service some of the noblest aspirations of the human race, peace, social justice, the brotherhood of man, and has used them with deadly effect. Very early in the Cold War, Lewis identified the Soviet Union as the prime threat to the world his generation had fought to save. Indeed, for Lewis, the World War and the Cold War melded into one. Like the Nazis, Lewis wrote, the communists are anti-Western in the double sense. They are against the Western powers, and they are also against the Western way of life. In the 1950s, he later said of the early Cold War, the choices before us still retain something of the clarity, even the starkness, which they had through the war years. In this struggle, there was no guarantee of victory. I am by no means certain, he wrote in the 1950s, that democracy represents the common destiny of mankind. In particular, he saw the Arabs preferring the Soviet Union for the same reason, as he put it, that their predecessors had preferred the Third Reich. In the Middle East, only democratic Turkey and democratic Israel were reliable. The Turks, because they had long experience of Russian imperialism, and the Jews, because of their long experience of Russian anti-Semitism. Turkey and Israel were the forward positions against the enemies of freedom, deserving full support. Now, in America, there were many who saw things as Lewis saw them, and I imagine that at any time, Lewis could have crossed the Atlantic permanently. But he settled late in this country, in 1974, at the age of 58, and almost missed his moment. When he arrived for good, the Scoop Jackson Democrats embraced him. But by then, the United States had already begun to roll back the Soviet Union in the Middle East. Lewis, in America, would be much more influential in defining what he once called the return of Islam as the next threat to freedom and democracy. That was the title of this famously prescient article published in Commentary in 1976. The Iranian Revolution in 1978 made the threat apparent in ways even he hadn't anticipated. By the time the Twin Towers came down on 9/11, no one had done as much to flag the danger as Bernard Lewis. In his first war, World War II, Lewis had been a bit player. In his second, the Cold War, a supporting actor. But in this one, he would play the lead. But there's a vast misunderstanding of how Lewis conceived this war. It can be attributed to Sam Huntington. When Huntington came up with his Clash of Civilizations, he credited Lewis with first use of the phrase. Now, technically, this was correct. Lewis coined it as early as the 1950s to describe the history of conflict between Islam and Christendom. But Lewis was uncomfortable with the way Huntington generalized his turn of phrase. On one occasion, he described Huntington's thesis to me as too harsh, and in one of his revised books, he replaced clash of civilizations with encounter. So it's unfortunate that so many obituaries focused on Lewis as the source of Huntington's concepts, because he wasn't. Lewis did believe in a perpetual clash, not between civilizations, but between freedom and tyranny. The threat to freedom could emerge from any civilization, including, obviously, Europe's, and democracy could take root in any civilization despite its origins in Europe. Anyone, he asserted, and I'm quoting, anywhere in the world could develop democratic institutions of a kind. Lewis believed that Islamism and extremes of Arabism were implacable foes of democracy and freedom, but he thought that Islam, the faith, wasn't antithetical to either. With Western, especially American, encouragement and assistance, Arab societies could evolve their own forms of democracy. Alas, if the Cold War lacked some of the starkness of World War II, this new and unnamed war, this crisis of Islam, seemed even more baffling than the Cold War. As Lewis himself acknowledged, and I quote him, "It is different today. We don't know the issues, and we still do not understand the nature of the enemy." So, was it Islam? Was it Islamism? Was it terrorism? Global jihad? "We are weak and undecided and irresolute," Lewis complained, "but I think the effort must be made. Either we bring them freedom or they destroy us." This is the voice of 1940 speaking. And at a simple reading, it seems like a jarring exaggeration. The Nazis could have destroyed, might have destroyed us if we hadn't defeated them and freed Germany. The Soviets could have finished us off in a morning. But who could today? Could any terrorist group, any Arab regime, or even Iran, come close to posing such a threat? No. But this statement shouldn't be read as a specific warning. It was Lewis's way of insisting that we must never take freedom and democracy for granted, as though they were the established way of humankind. In the World War and the Cold War, tyranny never surrendered. It only retreated when defeated. And unless it is defeated, where it still reigns, it might gradually, at first imperceptibly, roll back that which we've gained at great cost and ultimately confront us with the stark choices of 1940 again. Lewis, in the last chapter of his life, longed to see one more decisive victory within that civilization to which he devoted his scholarly life. He thought he glimpsed its beginnings in Iraq. Iraq, he said in 2008, when everyone had gone sour on it, and I quote him, "is being ruled by a democracy, by a free elected government that faces free opposition. It proves what is often disputed, that the development of democratic institutions in a Muslim Arab country is possible. What is happening in Iraq, I find profoundly encouraging," end of quote. Call it folly, call it hubris, call it the triumph of hope over experience, but also admit that it rests firmly upon the most fundamental belief that we all share, that all of humankind is created equal and deserves to govern itself by what Lewis once called the best and most just form of government yet devised by man. It's too early to say how Bernard Lewis will be remembered, but if the Middle East ever finds its way to democracy, he'll deserve to be recalled as the prophet of its freedom. Thank you.
First, I wish to thank Rob Satloff for the great honor of being part of any celebration of Bernard's life and contribution to the field that matters so much to all of us. Bernard Lewis had a greater impact on my life than anyone outside my immediate family. He was illumination. He was as warm as he was brilliant. He starred as my teacher and my friend. Bernard was my professor at Princeton, and he became my mentor too, but not within the walls of the university. I wasn't that kind of student. He wasn't that kind of mentor. In his graduate seminar on dhimmis, non-Muslims specially protected and taxed in Islamic lands, Bernard spotted me quickly as someone on a not long scholarly path. My interests were strictly horizontal, and Bernard did me the favor and the honor of taking that seriously. Being an amateur, even a dilettante, he said, was respectable. What possible fault in loving and in delighting in what you engage in? There is something, however, that you must be aware of. He specified by citing Milton, that one talent which is death to hide, lodged with me useless. It was something he repeated many times in the seasons that followed. I started college late at 27, and I finished my master's in 1984. For those years and for many after, I was unmarried, raising my children, and it was in that long period that Bernard became my most trusted friend. When you sit down weekly for years to figure out offspring and wars, junk bonds and popes, annoying friends and promising partners, and here I too wish to expressly acknowledge Bernard's loving other half, Bunsey Churchill. The friendship that develops is solid as rock, and it yields. The more you reveal, the less you need to say. The less said, the more you dare to reveal. The result is trust. This dynamic is true of friendship generally, I think, but when the friend is Bernard, and it is hard to keep to the past tense, a person of such concern and kindness, the nature of the trust is hard to describe. Security with wings is about the best I can do. More than a few times over the years, especially when he was extricating me from some psychic jam, imagined or real, I remarked to Bernard that he was the least neurotic person I had ever known. The accuracy of that assessment was borne out by his having no clue what I meant. About Bernard's stature and awe-inducing affect, like all his other qualities, it was for real, meaning he couldn't have helped it if he had wished to or tried. His gifts were so massive and various and conveyed in a syntax and voice of such grandeur that it could add up to something unnerving. Martin and Michael will remember, I'm sure, brown bag lunches in the days Bernard was anchoring the long table in Jones Hall. That's when you were sure that the less the guest speaker said, the more likely you were to hear something dazzlingly recondite and terrifyingly clever. Bernard was a showman. No one knew better than he the scope and surprise of what he could summon on the spur of the moment. And if you didn't happen to agree with every premise or point, of course, he reveled all the more. Who will forget the Mesa debate with Edward Said, assisted by Christopher Hitchens, and Bernard by Leon Whistletier? It was a draw only in the massive audience it attracted. Bernard towered. Two expressions of Bernard's friendship had an especially big effect on me. The first was his robust approval of the man I would marry. The other was identifying and locating me in the realm where I belonged, intellectually and creatively. He introduced the idea in 1997. There is a book to be written, Bernard said, about one of the most influential women in the 16th century Ottoman Empire, Venetian by birth, captured at 12 by Barbarossa, put into the harem and assigned to the son of Suleiman who succeeded him. Her name was Nurbanu. Same as yours, Bernard said, and you should write her story as fiction. I pointed out that I'd never written fiction, and he said that didn't matter. I added that I'd never written history, and he said that didn't matter either. And then he said something really stunning, that we would write this book together. And when I asked how that would work, all he said was, "Trust me." And of course I did. Years before, Bernard had written a few very brief impressions relevant to what Nurbanu's story might entail: visitors to the seraglio, eunuch habits, execution techniques. They are laced with his no-frills wit. Here is a little example. By ancient Ottoman rule, when a new sultan succeeded to the throne, his brothers were put to death to avoid wars of succession. The deaf mutes were used for this task, as well as for the removal of other persons whose continued existence was deemed unnecessary or dangerous. Members of the imperial house were strangled with a silken bowstring to avoid the impiety of shedding imperial blood. Erring or unnecessary concubines were tied in sacks and thrown into Marmara. He intended for this story to be written. For 2 years, all I did was read every book and monograph on Bernard's syllabus and shelves. For most of a third year, all I did was travel. In 2001, I gave Bernard the first draft, 500 pages. Without looking at it, he said, "Good, now write the next one." And when I asked about his part was when he let me know that I was going to write this book myself. He was launching me, of course, and he had been all along, but that didn't mean I wasn't very thrown by this turn. In the more than 3 years when I thought Bernard and I were, in a way I had yet to find out, doing this together, nothing about the book seemed a challenge. On my own, it was a different story in every sense. Finding the crux to an historical novel is a lot harder than I had imagined. When I finally did find it, Bernard endorsed the idea heartily, and within days I was, yet again, on a plane to Istanbul to see the world's expert on the subject. The Istanbul Observatory was demolished 3 years after it went up in 1577. No one anywhere knows more about it than Ekmeleddin İhsanoğlu, who, before running against President Erdogan in 2014, was the founding chair of the Department of History of Science at Istanbul University. At the end of a long and unforgettable day on his campus, what he left me with was pure gold. "No one can say for sure who destroyed the observatory or why," he said. "Meaning I can make it up?" I asked. "Meaning you can make it up." This is the kind of thing Bernard made happen all the time, for history and for fiction, creating this kind of mind-bending opening to whole new ways of thinking and imagining, while giving unswerving support week in and week out, which in the case of my book stretched to 20 years. Bernard's light will never not surround us. This gathering is a perfect example. Individuals whose lives and minds have been changed by Bernard's power to enlighten and to cause us, each in our way, to do something similar. Till recently, it was understood that light moved in straight lines. Today, physicists know what students of Bernard have known for 3/4 of a century. Light bends. From Bernard to us, to our varied and fruitful understandings of the world. Bernard, a pilot light, our ignition, our guide. Thank you.
Mike?
Thanks, Rob. Thanks to all of you for coming. It's a great honor. I'm actually a little choked up. Stop looking at me. I didn't think this would happen. I apologize. Anyway, listen, let me talk about George Shultz. I met George Shultz 3 times, and each time I had lunch with him. Not me alone, I was in a group, but it just so happened that the 3 times I met him, I was seated directly opposite him. And Shultz and I had exactly the same conversation 3 times. He said, you studied at Princeton? I said, yes. He said, Near Eastern Studies? I said, yes. He said, do you know Bernard Lewis? I said, yes. And then he said, key question, how often do you talk to him? And I would say, well, quite often. He was just testing whether I was, because there are 2 kinds of people in the world, those who like Bernard Lewis and those who don't. And so he was just trying to find out which side I was on. And once I was on the side that liked him, that was all right. It was Bernard was remarkable in that way, in that people of power and consequence wanted to talk to him and to be around him. I've never seen anything like it. When one of the first times I was in a public event with Bernard, we went from Princeton to Philadelphia. God, I'm such a girly man. You know, there are two.
You cannot say that.
I have 2 great moments of personal awakening in my life. The first is when I realized that I would not be Clint Eastwood. You know, I grew up in the Midwest watching westerns and everything, and I thought I would grow up to be silent and strong and leading men into battle. At some point, I realized I wouldn't do that. The second moment, which I'll come to in a bit, is when I realized I wouldn't be Bernard Lewis. But anyway, I went to this public event with Bernard in Philadelphia, arranged by Buncy and her organization, and Henry Kissinger was there. It was a very large gathering. There were hundreds of people in this room, and we walked in, and Henry Kissinger immediately made a beeline for Bernard, and he knocked down people like a bowling ball knocking down pins. And I had 2 reactions to this. The first was, my God, Henry Kissinger is short. The guy, he's about a little bit taller than a hobbit, and this was amazing to me. But
There goes that Kissinger chair for you.
Yeah, I don't think it was in train anyway. The second thing though was how amazing it was that Kissinger just wanted to talk to Bernard about what was going on that day in the Middle East. So what I want to do today here is I want to talk a little bit about why he was, some aspects of his greatness, why he was so great, but then also a little bit about why that greatness is so controversial, why it will never be recognized. I think those of us who recognize that greatness will, I think, always be in the minority. So first of all, the greatness. Anyone who knows Bernard or is familiar with his work knows what an incredible grasp of languages he had, and what an incredible grasp of sources. I mean, he had a photographic memory. Now that meant not just Middle Eastern Islamic sources. It also meant Western history. I mean, he had an incredible grasp of Western history, and it's that basis that allowed him to make these amazing comparisons on what I think is correct to say a kind of civilizational level between the West and the Middle East. Bernard had in his mind a very clear definition of what the West was, and he had a very clear definition in his head of what the Middle East was, based on the high culture of both. He had a clear definition, and he had an absolutely unrivaled definition. I mean, as Katherine said at these brown bag lunches in the Near Eastern Studies Department, the number of times I saw him just lay waste to people who tried to argue with him about these things. And I mean very nicely. The thing about someone once said about Bernard is Bernard could stick the knife in and pull it out, and you'd be sitting there bleeding to death, and you didn't even know it, right? Because it was so incisive. Now, he had that incredible capacity, and then he had this historical framework that he constructed in order to bring to bear that understanding. Some of you may have read, I wrote an appreciation of Bernard after he passed away, and I noted in there that Bernard was actually a Turkish historian, meaning he was working within a Turkish nationalist historical tradition. I think this is people often miss this aspect of his thinking. It doesn't diminish from him in the least, I think, to say that he didn't construct this thing out of whole cloth, purely out of his own mind. It was the work of many Turkish scholars trying to understand the way the Ottoman Empire modernized. He brought his own unique viewpoint to that. And he brought his own unique skills, but it really is a kind of Turkish nationalist worldview, and it's based on the idea that there was the traditional Middle East, and then the Western impact, and there were channels of borrowing from the West, particularly in the beginning along the lines of the military and technology, and then later in the cultural realm. Nobody could tell this story better than Bernard Lewis because of the depth of his understanding, as I said, about what the Middle East was and what the West is. One of my favorite books of his is The Political Language of Islam. If you haven't read it, have a look at it. If you have read it, go back and look at it again. It's such a simple little thing. He just goes through term by term. And he describes the classical meaning of the word in the Islamic tradition, and then the way the term has been revalued, I guess you would say, in the modern era under the impact of the West. You can only it's such a deceptively simple little book. You can only write a book like that if you have in your head, as I said, this understanding of what the Western tradition is, and how it came in and remolded aspects of the modern Middle East. Now, when I got to graduate school, I was actually never Bernard's student, to be exact. By the time I got there, he'd already retired. So I was his research assistant for a while. And I benefited greatly from my association with him. But I actually had fantasies when I arrived of correcting the Bernard Lewis record. I didn't want to. I was not a revolutionary. I didn't want to overturn Bernard Lewis, but I thought there were aspects of Middle Eastern history that the Lewis framework, let's call it that, did not do justice to. But then, and this is what I mentioned before about the Clint Eastwood story, then I came into contact with Ottoman texts. And I know exactly the moment when I realized I would never be Bernard Lewis or anything close in that regard. And that was I was taking a seminar with the great Ottomanist Halil İnalcık, for those of you who know him, and I wrote a paper based on Ottoman documents, on land registers, and I tried to write a Lewis-style essay focused around the word hirbe. Hirbe is from the Hebrew, Horban, and hirbe in Arabic, it means ruins. And the land registers that I looked at had lots of hirbes in them. So you have the name of a town, and then next to the town you have hirbe this, hirbe that, and so on. And so, this land registers were full of ruins, so I assumed that there were lots of ruins around. And actually, as Professor İnalcık demonstrated in front of all the other students in the seminar, hirbe doesn't actually mean, it does. If you have a lot of hirbes in a land register, it means that it's an era of great prosperity, not an era of economic decline. And the reason for that is that when you have a powerful central government, then people move out from the larger towns to little satellite villages, and those satellite villages are known as hirbe this and hirbe that. And so I learned two things from this. One is Three things, actually, I learned. The first is never, ever build an argument around the meaning of one word, and I've never done that since, ever. I took that into government. I never, ever built an argument around a single intelligence report either. Whenever I see people do that, I always remember, here, babe, don't do it. Because just one little fact changes and your whole argument disappears. The second thing I learned was study an era of the Middle East after the advent of the typewriter. Because trying to actually read these documents, forget about the language, which is hard enough by itself, but to actually just read the manuscripts is nearly impossible. I actually developed a theory, which I'm sticking with for reasons of for needs of my own ego, which is that there is actually no such thing as the Ottoman language. That really this is just a huge practical joke that Ottoman bureaucrats in the 16th and 17th century played on later historians by putting a lot of scribbles on the paper and then sticking it into the archives, thinking about the pain it would cause graduate students in 20th century America. But the third thing I learned, as I've already said, is that I was never going to be an Ottomanist. Because I couldn't I could spend my entire life looking at these documents, and I was never, ever going to master them. This is a very simple thing, but it's a very simple fact, but it's huge when grappling with who Bernard Lewis was, because he didn't just know Ottoman. He knew Persian, he knew Arabic, he knew 12 other languages, and he really knew them. The number of non-Turkish Ottoman scholars in America today who can go to the archives and do what Bernard Lewis did is extremely small. I wouldn't want to count them on I wouldn't want to embarrass anyone by saying how small it is, but it's infinitesimal, really. So you have to know the languages, you have to have the ability to master all of the sources, and then you have to build the intellectual framework. There are very, very few people who could do such a thing. In fact, it's unique, I believe. Now, why this framework? Why this is always going to be contested? We have to look at Edward Said and his attack on Bernard. And I completely agree with Katherine that Bernard won the debate. And in my mind, hands down, intellectually won the debate. But Said won the politics. And for that, you have to understand the United States and I think the modern world. We are building in the United States and a society that does not recognize differences in race, religion, creed, and so forth, an ecumenical society. And the anthem of our age is Michael Jackson's "We Are the World." And Bernard Lewis had a framework that said there's a West and there's a Middle East, and they're different. And in order to understand what's going on in the Middle East today, you have to have a grasp of this difference. That fact alone, that already sets him intellectually at odds with the prevailing ethos. What Edward Said did was a very simple political trick, I would say, or a political position. Is he just said, everything that you Americans know about race relations in America, about the relations between blacks and whites in America, applies to the Middle East. You just have to understand that the Muslims, the Arabs and Muslims, are in the position of oppressed black people in America, and Europe represents tyrannical white rule. And all of the attitudes that you've had, you can apply. You don't need to know the details. All those niggling details that somebody like Bernard Lewis knows, you don't need to know them. You don't need to know all of the history. You just have to understand the essential power relations. And any backlash, any movement of violent opposition to the West from the Middle East, you should understand as a reaction to the oppression of the European. That's a very powerful political message that is continuing to resonate. And if you watch, lately clips from universities and you see students in lectures, in the Middle Eastern lectures, when people are saying things about the Middle East that the students don't like, and they start clamoring and waving banners and beating on drums. There's no way to beat that intellectually. I mean, that's just a political position, and until the field of Middle Eastern studies, and I have no hope of this at all, actually, but until it returns to an appreciation of intellectual values over these political values, Bernard Lewis's legacy is going to be controversial, to say the least. I'll bring my remarks to an end here, but I'll just say that I think the way Bernard dealt with all of this was exemplary for all of us. He did have enormous, anybody who knows him knows he had enormous confidence, in intellectual and personally. He never had a doubt. He never had a doubt about the correctness of his position, and he was remarkably unbitter about it, about the attacks on him, which were extremely nasty, petty, unfair. I could go on with other adjectives, but I'll stop there. But I'll just say that for me, that character quality, the backbone, the dignity, I think that is one of the most attractive aspects of his legacy, of remaining true to an intellectual vision when under unfair political attack. Thank you.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Martin, Katherine, and Mike. Three very different but three very powerful remembrances and appreciations of the scholar of consequence. I was there that day, actually, in 1986 at the Mesa conference. Was anybody else there that day?
Martin was he? Yeah.
Yes, you were there, yeah. I felt horrible for Professor Lewis. We had never met. I think I went up to him and shook his hand at one point during the conference, but I felt horrible because it actually wasn't a debate. It wasn't like Ali Frazier, two accomplished boxers in a ring having it out the way one would hope two accomplished professionals would have it out. And like we've had often on this panel, there were two completely different approaches to it. I mean, it was like a ballerina and Hulk Hogan. It was two very different professionals performing very different with very different skills. As you said, Professor Said had no interest in fact, in argument, in history. He was interested in changing how we would think about the Middle East through the lens of contemporary American politics. It was not at all based in knowledge and history. And what I felt horrible about was Per Bernard was actually trying to be a historian in a room that did not appreciate that one iota. And perhaps other than the half a dozen of us who are here today and maybe another half a dozen, it was the most inhospitable room that he may have ever been in. And that was also very sad. It was with great glee that he eventually got his comeuppance. That Said eventually got his comeuppance. But the idea that Bernard's prescience was eventually understood and accepted and recognized. And I think that I'm a little bit more hopeful on this act, in that I think that there is indeed a vigorous debate out there. I don't think the Saidians, in certain university circles, perhaps that's the case, but I think in the great public discourse, I think there's a more vigorous debate than we give credit for. And I don't think we should assume that merely what goes on in academic seminar rooms is the sum total of our national debate on these issues.
Rob, can I just say that the fact, Bernard knew how hostile it was going to be, and he had a choice not to go. It goes to what you said about his confidence. It didn't occur to him not to go. He went in there and did his best as he knew how to do it.
I can't say if my memory serves me right. I don't think Leon did him any great help that day.
You can get it on YouTube.
Right.
Yeah, maybe just I was there, and I also viewed it again on YouTube. Bernard went to that event expecting this would be a scholarly deliberation. He overestimated his audience in many respects. The title of the theme of the event was the media in the Middle East, which already put him at a disadvantage. And then he made a technical error. It was a formal debate. And he structured his presentation, as I recall, as a lecture where you build up to your final conclusion at the end. And William McNeill, who was the chairman of that session, simply cut him off before he made his major point. I met Edward Said only once, and it was in the week following that. And he told me how he had structured his presentation, which was like a newspaper article in the old days where you made all your points in descending order of importance. So that created the effect of a Said victory there, amplified by the reaction of the audience. But it should be remembered that there was an earlier round in print in the New York Review of Books, and it was universally acknowledged at the time that Lewis won that debate hands down. Mm-hmm. So I don't know why he went again to this. Maybe it was a sense of duty. Mm-hmm. But to my mind, the whole thing was a setup.
Yeah. Harold, can you take the mic, please?
Professor Lewis knew very well what was going to happen there. I remember asking him, why are you going? What's on your mind when you know this is going to be an enormously hostile audience that's not going to listen? And he responded, he said, if I had a choice in the good old days, shall we say, when the New York Times was a little different than it is today, if I had a choice then of writing for the New York Times or for Pravda, I'd write for Pravda, because at least I could have maybe there's one or two people I could influence. But there was no way he could, he knew what he was getting into. He didn't see it as a debate. He was going into enemy territory. That's how I remember the conversation about it. That's how he talked about it.
Just one other comment on a totally different topic, just to then launch into a discussion. I want to ask our panelists. I have two questions I want to ask our panelists, and then invite any questions from the audience. So my first question is partially answered by Mike's reference to the political language of Islam, which is your favorite book, your favorite Bernard Lewis book. And there is, obviously there's many to choose from, but there's one sentence in the, the short history of the 2,000 years that stands in my mind. I apologize, I'm paraphrasing here, but there's one sentence that stands in my mind that has helped me understand modern Middle East politics and has helped me appreciate Bernard's vast understanding of the last 1,500 years, where somewhere toward the end of the book he refers to how and again I'm paraphrasing, how the smallest tin pot dictator in today's Middle East has more power at his disposal, power in terms of the power of the state, the power of technology, the power to eavesdrop on people, the power to commit mass genocide, has more power at his disposal than the greatest sultan at the height of the Ottoman Empire. And I think at the time, I think it was a reference to Hafiz al-Assad, but it really didn't make a difference. But in order to make that statement, you had to understand the last 1,000 years of history. And you had to understand both the limitations of the greatest sultan at the height of his power and understand how states work today. And there were so few historians really, you ran out of fingers without counting on one hand. There are so few that I think that can make in one sentence a claim that distills 1,000 years of expertise. So that's going to be my candidate for favorite book, although there are many others that come in an honorable mention. But I would welcome any candidates for favorite book. Martin?
Well, first, it's important to ask what Bernard's favorite book was. A lot of people said that his most important work, by consensus, was The Emergence of Modern Turkey. But when asked about this, Bernard would say that that book will one day be superseded. It was a work of synthesis of a vast amount of learning, especially from the work of Turkish scholars. But he said that another book would come along, and there are some who would even argue now that a few other books have come along which have superseded that book as an introductory text. The book he liked the most, he thought would be the most lasting, was The Muslim Discovery of Europe. This was a book about cross-cultural interchange, Muslim travelers and ambassadors going to European courts. Only someone with Bernard's skill set could have written such a book. And since no one else would ever have that skill set, he thought it was likely well outlast his other writings. My own book, which I assigned to students because it's short and in it Bernard rises above the Middle East to look more broadly at issues, is a short book called History, Remembered, Recovered, Invented. It was a series of lectures that he gave. It was a historian stepping back from his field and talking about his method. And I think that that book also will last, and it's an excellent introductory text for students beginning their adventure in history.
Okay. Katherine?
Mine was The Emergence of Modern Turkey. I studied it with Bernard as an undergraduate, and it was exactly my speed because it was introductory. And to be introduced by that voice, that means, that scope of knowledge was, I knew I was onto something, embarking on something that would hold my interest for a long time, and I was doing it with a master. I think anyone who's read that has had a similar feeling. But for me, coming at it with no background, it was just thrilling.
Mike, you want to amend your original candidate, Political Language of Islam?
I was going to, actually, Martin stole my thunder. I was going to say History Remembered, Recovered, and Invented, which is actually out of print. But I like the quirky ones, like Political Language of Islam and History Remembered, Recovered, and Invented. He has a little book, I wouldn't call it one of my favorites, but it's sort of an amazing, Istanbul and the Civilization of the Ottoman Empire, which is just stuff that was left over from it's the stuff that, you know, that's when you write an article remains on your computer. That's the amazing thing, you know. I mean, Bernard had a ton of this material around. I hated it when whenever he sent me to the library to look up a source, and I had to come back and tell him that I failed. I hated it. But he had a folder full of translations of Arabic poems that he had made over the years, and he had me go, you know, try to dig them up, but he didn't have any citations on them. They were just the poet and the poem. Istanbul and the Civilization of the Ottoman Empire is really a lot of stuff that he translated for that. For the rise of modern Turkey, and he said, "Oh, you know what? I got a book here." So he just
very good. Let me turn the floor over to comments, questions from the audience. We'll begin. Bunsie, thank you so much for being here. Bunsie Churchill.
Thank you, panel. Beautifully done in different ways. I have to add a couple of postscripts, if I may. Michael, your remembering that conference was my 90th birthday present to him from the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. In other words, I wrote to Henry Kissinger and I said, as the lady in Bernard's life, it's just easier for me to plan a conference than it is to bake a cake. So but the great part of that was Kissinger's comment where he said, they used to have lunch every couple times a year. And Kissinger said the reason he enjoyed having lunch with Bernard so much is that it was very different from other luncheons. Because with Bernard, he listened. And the other comment, given your comments about the Said debate. By the way, it is on YouTube. I found it very difficult to watch. But I think the best comment about that and about Said was the title of an article by David Price Jones, which is called Enough Said.
Okay. Thank you very much. Ambassador Yassin?
Thank you. That was fascinating. I have a question.
Please.
We're all laymen. You're experts. You've known Bernard Lewis much better than we'll ever, perhaps even members of his family or extended family. His books are accessible. Has anybody looked at his unpublished work? And in particular, what he did during the Second World War? I'm sure that there are a lot of reports that might be worth digging up because they might show a young mind at work exploring. Maybe you could task some of your smart students to go and dig them up. Thank you.
Martin?
I haven't been to the archives, to the National Archives in London to look him up. By his own account, he was a fairly small cog in a machine. He wasn't doing high-level policy analysis for anyone. But I do think that one might find more interesting things in the archives of Chatham House in the 1950s. Chatham House had commissioned him to do The Emergence of Modern Turkey, Royal Institute of International Affairs, and so he was regularly traveling to the region. Now, some of his findings he published. I imagine there may be some other reports that were not published, which would make for interesting reading in that period. He gave me once some material that he'd collected surrounding his visit in 1960 to the Congress of Orientalists, which was held in Moscow. It was a know thine enemy venture for him to go to Moscow that year. Interesting material. Maybe at some point I'll publish it myself.
Mike, do you know of anything
I don't. I know he
on the
wrote
published work?
he wrote a book. I shouldn't even mention this because he didn't like the book for some reason. He wouldn't tell me why. He was actually a very shy guy, but he has a book called Turkey Today, which I discovered in an obscure library, and I mentioned it to him, and he said, "Oh, where'd you find that?" And it's not on the Wikipedia list of his books. And I know there's probably, knowing Bernard, there's probably a paragraph in there where there's something incorrect, and it's very embarrassing to him or something. I don't know. But there are very few of us who don't have books that we don't want people to see. He gave me. I have in my. He asked me one time to look up in the British archives. I was going over to London and to look up. He'd seen in the newspaper. Unfortunately, I didn't have I didn't have the smarts to ask him more details, but he had seen a story about a plan to kill by the Nazis to kill Churchill at the Casablanca conference, and it was foiled by British intelligence. And he asked me to go dig up those files, which I did. It didn't occur to me that maybe that had something to do with his work. There was nothing in it that showed me, but perhaps, and I don't know that he did anything with that. I don't think in the end, my impression, I could be very wrong about this, I don't think he left a lot on the cutting room floor because of, as I said, the way he worked. I mean, he made the translations he made, he was so gifted at language and everything, the translations he made of stuff was publishable. Anything that was publishable, I think in the end he did publish, and everything that he produced was of such a high quality when it came. As I mentioned in my appreciation of him, by the time I know him, he didn't type or write. He just dictated, and there wasn't a lot that was that didn't see that was valuable that didn't see publication.
By the way, he did. Write and translate a lot of poetry. The poem that I quoted was only published for the first time in his memoirs, if I'm not mistaken. Some of the poems he published under a pseudonym. He does have a collection of poems called Music of a Distant Drummer. And that's a window into his inner life, I think. Talking about books which he published and regretted publishing, the one I mentioned earlier, The Origins of Ismailism, which was his PhD thesis, he regretted later having published. He did it for the reasons I mentioned. And then some years later, it went out of copyright and someone else was going to publish it without his permission. He was very upset at that prospect. And he went back and got the publisher's permission to give it a foreword in which he explains the circumstances in which he published. Bernard used to say that every author comes to regret his first book. Unfortunately, you can't go to straight away to writing your second, so.
Yes, Bob?
Yeah, I only had one encounter with Bernard Lewis, and I owe it actually to my daughter, who was a student at Princeton, and I used her name in order to get him to come to the National Defense University, where I was teaching on a 2-year leave of absence from the Department of Energy. And I got a couple of colleagues, and we took him to the Officers Club for lunch. And this vignette is basically to illustrate his sense of humor. I don't remember what he was going to talk about, presumably something to do with the Middle East. But I do remember this little story. He was talking about a Jew, a Muslim, and a Catholic died and went to heaven. And they were being shown around by St. Peter. And when they came to the Catholic portion of heaven, St. Peter said, "Now, shh, be very quiet." And the rabbi and the imam or whoever asked, "Well, why?" And he said, "Well, they think they're the only ones here."
That reminds me, if I may, about books of his that we like. One of the quirky books that I really like is A Middle East Mosaic. I also worked as his research assistant on part of that. And, he loved ethnic jokes, and so do I. And they're totally politically incorrect now. And, but he enjoyed other people's ethnic jokes, too. So the Middle East Mosaic is just a collection of primary source documents covering things great and small in the Middle East, and there's a section in there with a lot of. He had an incredible repertoire of them. He had one I remember. I don't remember very
Careful.
well. Yeah, no, it's about Scandinavians. It's about you can joke about Scandinavians without offending anybody, but he liked it because it was a double-barreled one. And I actually don't remember the joke, but it's something like. What a Dane would say about a Swede, what's a Swede, a German in training or something. I don't know. So you got both the Swedes and the Germans. I don't actually remember the joke, but that was the.
Alan Makovsky, yes.
Thanks a lot, and congratulations to the panel. I have to say the memories really, as a former student, really come flooding back. I remember when I was a student anyway, Bernard used to refer to his students as his intellectual progeny, so I'm pretty sure he would be a very proud father listening to this panel. I do have a question, but just very quickly, one thing, I'm not sure that it was mentioned, but the extraordinary amount of time that he gave to his students, I think really must be remembered. I'm sure all of you took the walk in the woods at the Institute for Advanced Studies, and sometimes these walks would last an hour or 2 hours, or I remember on one occasion even longer. And I also remember many jokes, ethnic and otherwise, that he told. He was an amazing raconteur. In addition to all the other outstanding qualities that you touched upon. I was curious, Katherine, I used to find for myself, and I know this is really a terrible thing to say.
But you're going to say it anyway.
But I'm going to say it anyway. I mean, because no one would ever see any resemblance between my writing and Bernard Lewis's. But I used to feel that my writing would improve by reading Bernard Lewis. I think he's the greatest essayist I've ever read, and in any field. And I just wonder, you wrote a very different type. I mean, you wrote fiction very differently than what he's known for. I just wondered, did his writing influence your writing at all? And I had also for Martin, this is maybe a very marginal question, but you said that there are some works now which are said to have supplanted, or some people claim have supplanted, emergence of modern Turkey, for which I have a special fondness, particularly the beginning of the second part of the book, where he goes through Ataturk's philosophy, which I think is just extraordinary, and I've always recommended it to people as a starting point for understanding modern Turkey. What are these other works that you had in mind when you said that? Sorry to have gone on so long.
Katherine?
His writing, I stood in awe of his writing, and it influenced me in that I would aspire to his succinctness. What influenced me more as I wrote the book was being able to consult with him about what was plausible. So it was his way of thinking. It's sort of like an emotional anachronisms. I wanted to make sure, and he always had a clear sense of this. Would somebody be thinking this way? Would two people relate to each other this way? And he was extremely sure-footed in his guidance in an area that I don't think he normally wandered around in. It was enormously helpful. It's all through the book about motivation.
Martin?
Well, the book that's largely supplanted Emergence of Modern Turkey in syllabi today is Eric Zerker's book, Turkey, A Modern History. Remember that the Emergence of Modern Turkey also ends in 1950. Those who use one work on Turkey in their syllabus usually wind up using Zercher. And he was, and I teach in Israel, and I assigned both books. And both actually were translated into Hebrew. Bernard's much earlier, Zercher's later.
Great, thank you. Yes, please, up in front.
Hi, so I was really interested in what you, Michael, said about the value placed on politics versus intellectual honesty. And as an undergraduate student, I find it really hard to talk about certain subjects, especially Islam. I had written a research project about the viability of political Islam in Turkey and whether or not that was a reality. And I was wondering if, I'm not really familiar if Bernard Lewis had talked about the distinction between political Islam and civil Islam and what his opinion was on that, and all of yours opinions. I'd be curious to know.
I guess the best starting point for you on that would just be to read What Went Wrong and to read how he dealt with it there, but also his famous essay, The Return of Islam, which nobody here mentioned. I think we're also aware of it because it was prescient. He had an understanding of Islam, a multidimensional understanding of Islam, so he saw, and it was at the center, that understanding was at the center of his historical work, and so he never saw it as a factor that had, like a lot of the people who were working in the 1950s and 60s, and modernization theory was the dominant, and everyone just sort of assumed that the Middle East was going to go on a trajectory like the West to secular nation states. He always understood that there were deeper bonds of affinity and identity in the region that could be mobilized for political action. And I think that's the way to understand it, less as a political analyst than as a historian looking at contemporary politics. As for me, all I can tell you is, listen, good luck. I got out of academia, and there's every day I thank God that I found my wife and that I got out of academia. So I would say, run away.
Let me ask, actually, I wanted to ask about a theme that that came up in our earlier discussion about Bernard and democracy, especially democracy in the Middle East. I mean, the usual sort of Sayedian critique of Bernard Lewis is that Bernard and other sort of Orientalists have no appreciation for and true understanding of Muslims as Muslims. In fact, I think it's quite the opposite, the other way around, where the depth of compassion for Arabs and Muslims is remarkable in Bernard's work, and I think it no much more than his sort of cheerleading for the idea that Arab Muslims can create their own democracy. You know, let's not be patronizing about it. They can do it. You know, let's give them the tools. Let's help them out and let them do it. So I'm interested in the view of the panelists as to now that democracy seems to be a dirty word in much of the Middle East. Will there be a tarnishing of Bernard's reputation as a result of that? And Ambassador, I'd be interested, if it doesn't put you on the spot a bit, I know that Bernard is sort of adored in Turkey for his connection with Turkish history. Is he at all viewed by any Iraqis with special connection because of his championing of the idea of democracy there? So I'd be interested in both views. The answer may be no. I don't know.
Well, the interests of most Iraqis are very down to earth, so they don't have. But within the intellectual elites, I think most are of the other school. My own perspective is that both he and the other school are partially right and partially wrong, and that's proper to the Middle East, which is extremely complex and even complicated.
And now we know why you're such a successful diplomat. Colleagues, any comment?
Bernard's position over time evolved. I think that you have to remember in the Second World War, in 1940, about 10% of the world's population lived in democracies. At the end of that war, in the aftermath, it was 30%. By the end of the Cold War, it was 50%. And this led him to the conclusion that while democracy had obviously specific origins in a specific cultural and political setting, that it could be universally applicable. And this led him, particularly in later years, to make a very different argument than he made at the outset, which was that if one looked in Islam, one could find all kinds of elements which would be supportive of democracy, such as consultative government, limited government, the idea of God as sovereign, not any human having the same authority as the divine, and so forth and so on. Now, you touched on exactly the paradox. Yes, Bernard taught us differences, but at the end of the day, his emphasis from a political point of view was that the similarities were more important, the shared humanity. And this was never appreciated by his critics. And that was because the perception of him was entirely colored by what they saw as his position on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, the Israeli-Arab issue, where they identified him with the historic opponent of Arab aspirations. So they missed the key point about Lewis. But it's not, I mean, if you go to I had an article on foreignaffairs.com called The Conflicted Legacy of Bernard Lewis, and it's a catalog of all of the misunderstandings and misperceptions of Lewis, which arose precisely from this one difference of political opinion.
Any other comment?
My understanding of this is based on my view of him as a Kemalist. His discussion of the Arab world was based on his I believe, his understanding of the trajectory that Turkey underwent, and clearly Turkey made the transition. I think it was for him a very influential moment when Turkish democracy, he saw it with his own eyes as Turkish democracy was taking root. And I think he was always making the comparison explicitly or implicitly in his mind between what was happening in the Arab world and the trajectory that Turkey had undergone. He had a line that he used to say, Martin, you'd probably, or maybe Katherine, you remember, about democracy, where he said, comparing it to a cure, and saying you have to have it in small doses or the cure will kill you. I can't remember how it was a typical kind of Bernard, really pithy little line. So most of his career, I think he was skeptical about Western democracy promotion. I think he got a little bit carried away in the end. And Martin may disagree with me about that, but I think a lot of us got carried away in the Iraq War, in being a little bit over-optimistic about it.
Okay. We're going to have to bring this to a close, but Harold, you have one last...
Sometime, I think, in the mid-90s, he wrote a little book called Predictions. And he said he would not be surprised if Turkey and Iran switched places, meaning Turkey going the way it is today, by democracy into back towards, shall we say, the Ottoman center. We're running the world, we're going to take over, as opposed to Iran, which will come to its senses and join, shall we say, the international community of nations, whatever that is.
By the way, though, that book, The Middle East Mosaic, has a section with jokes, has a section on predictions, which is fantastic.
Okay. Tom, I apologize. We have to. We're over 2, and with this, I don't like to break the rule here. So, friends, I do want to thank Martin, Katherine, and Mike. I want to thank all of you. Those of you who knew Bernard Lewis, those of you who knew him only through his work or knew him only through his impact and influence on the way we see the Middle East and his impact on the way we think about the Middle East. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for contributing to our appreciation of this scholar of great consequence. Thank you. Are you kidding me?